Have you ever felt like adults suck? Like the authorities should never be trusted? Have you ever felt like life should be lived in the woods, psychedelics should be taken for breakfast, and traditional values should be protested against over the sweet sound of the Beatles? Then you are strange and need help, but you will love this topic, the culture and counterculture of the 60s. The culture movement of the 1960s was a boom of cultural changes and challenges propelled by the unconventional youth. Its slogan, "Trust no one over 30, says it all. Youths distrusted authority and protested for what they wanted to see get changed. Like warriors, but more like this. In the late 1950s, weekly church-going declined from 48% to 41% by the end of the 1960s. Educated Americans were becoming more secular, and less educated Americans were becoming more religious, and Jonathan Edwards is crying. This shift towards secularism was a continuation of the challenging of traditionalist beliefs of the 1920s with the Scopes monkey trial, you remember that, and churches were becoming more modernized. The roots of this movement could be ascribed to the Beatniks, who were edgy nonconformists that sprouted from New York City, and were led by writers like Jack Kerouac and poet Allen Ginsberg. They were kind of like the founding fathers of the hippie movement. To give you a glimpse of just how edgy these people were, this is a short poem by Allen Ginsberg. What's burning in my head? Self-loathing? I hate myself. What literary abstraction? Ha, I'll kill that fly. You know what? Go off. They would encourage drug use, a sexual revolution, free speech, and hardcore music like rock and roll. The frustrated youth would be further represented in media with movies, such as The Wild One with Marlon Brando and Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean. And if you've seen James Dean and Marlon Brando before, you'll know why these teens were so frustrated. What was this movement caused by? In the 1960s, there was an array of issues that were overlooked and were now given attention to, such as poverty in America, war, and social inequalities of any kind. So the youth saw themselves fully capable of bringing about this change. Traditions that seemed restrictive were being challenged. And as you can probably tell, there was a lot of casual sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Awesome, yeah! So before we get into the good stuff, I'm going to show you the activity portion of this project, which is a life of a 1960s teen video-ish kind of thing, so hope you like it. Oh, hello! Didn't see you there. I'm Florence. Groovy to meet you. Do you want to know what it's like to be a teen in the 60s? No? You're being forced to watch this for a Well, I'm gonna show you anyways, because this is awesome, and I worked hard on it, please like it. My day starts off in the kitchen, with breakfast, which is made by my mom. My mom is a stay-at-home mom, as almost 50% of married women in the 1960s almost 50% of married women in the 1960s were still stay-at-home moms, but that stereotype will be challenged with the rise of feminism. For some reason, I just have that statistic in my mind all the time. Food in the 1960s consisted of sugary cereals and junk food popularized in the 1950s, and this is when the food looked like mutations, but were nonetheless interesting to the eye. After breakfast, I enjoy some of my hobbies, such as listening to music. I mean, look at my epic vinyl collection. I spent a lot of bread on this, and my parents just want me to do something productive, like getting a job or taking a shower. But I say screw them, because you know what I'm a Believer by the Monkees, Sugar Sugar by the Archies, and The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, and they do not. But we cannot forget the baddest boys in town, which are the Beatles, and what I like to call them BTS, and my bias is Ringo Starr, because in my eyes, he is the star, not Paul McCartney. Okay, well that's a little controversial. Music was a huge part of the 60s, and Woodstock, a massive music festival, would happen in 1969, and legend has it that the stench from that festival might never actually go away, like ever. Then I like to hang out with my friends and go to drive-in movie theaters, watch TV, go to fast food restaurants, go to the mall and smoke cigarettes. Yeah, a lot of teens did that at the time, and it wasn't such a big deal, but, you know, you honors kids can't relate. My family went to the movies a lot during this time. Some movies that we watched were Sound of Music, Breakfast at Tiffany's, and How to Murder Your Wife. And after watching that, I couldn't find my mom, but that's okay. Yeah, aside from reading the Rolling Stones and watching TV, there wasn't much to do, so we hooked up with people. Okay, hear me out. We were pretty bored, and and you know what? Premarital sex was becoming more acceptable. And birth control was becoming more accessible. Come on, you have to cut us some slack. And to make this even more spicy, I have had a boyfriend and a girlfriend, because you know what? In this day and age, we can do it with whoever we want. Love is love. You know what I'm saying? And as much as I wanted to go to church, I just couldn't, because they just talked about, man and woman and don't sleep with people all the time. And I was just so bored, Ooh, fashion. Okay, so a lot of the fashion was awesome. I mean, look at me. I mean, do you see me? Anyways, fashion was very vibrant and pattern filled. And here are some examples. That section just to make this longer. Anyways, some important figures were JFK, Martin Luther King, Elvis Presley, Muhammad Ali, and Fidel Castro. And as you can tell, there would be like a rise of celebrity culture starting from the 1930s. To make things more fun, here are some many things that happened in the 60s. The birth of Princess Diana, the birth of Barack Obama, my dad, the first Hollywood Walk of Fame star, the first Ken doll, the first Bob Dylan album, the first Disney World, and the death of Disney, JFK, and Marilyn Monroe. So you're probably wondering, what were these hippies so passionate about? And that's a good question. The movement was caused by a lot of issues that were once being overlooked, and now they were given the proper attention, such as poverty in America, war, and social inequalities of any kind. So the youth saw themselves as fully capable of bringing about change they wanted to see. The protests that we would associate with the 60s were mostly by young people around the college age. One of the first organized protests against authority would take place in UC Berkeley, as there was a ban on using campus space for political debate. Ideas would spread around that the megaversity cared more about corporate values than human values. As protests got more intense and less clean-cut, a counterculture would form because America's traditional, orderly ways of society were being challenged. For some reason, the hippies were so mad about something, like all the time, but it's a good kind of mad because they were fighting for what's right, such as poverty and starvation, which LBJ's Great Society would help to do. At the time, 20% of Americans were living in poverty, so a lot of change needed to happen. They would also protest against war, especially with the Vietnam War, and they would do teach-ins where they'd protest at university, and so this is where the peace-love sentiment came from. An important group was the Students for a Democratic Society, who would fight against poverty and war, and they'd create a group called the Weathermen who would cough up a storm wherever they were for the sake of fighting poverty and war. A sexual revolution would occur as well, where sex is viewed as more casual with the introduction of the birth control pill. This would be a continuation of Margaret Sanger's promotion of birth control and free love in the 1920s. Sex between man and woman was also seen as restrictive, so traditions were being broken as homosexual relations would spring up fast and plentifully. Unfortunately, AIDS would rise up as a result of careless sex, especially with the male homosexual community. So yes, too much love really could kill you. I'm sorry. And the crystal on top, there was a drug revolution. But it was more than just getting high, as the drugs were seen as the keys to the door of one's higher consciousness. But in reality, they were really just getting addicted to the dopamine. But it's okay. Some other changes were in the earth. Save the turtle. So the environment would be fought for a lot. And so this movement would start with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which would talk about how the earth should be conserved, and I agree. Feminism would also be fought for, and it's still being fought for, kind of. And so topics such as equal pay, sexual liberties, and higher social representation were being challenged. And I know you remember Betty Friedan's feminist mystique, which would kind of propel all of this feminism stuff. She basically said, no women in kitchen, woman in collar, woman in desk job. And the peace-love sentiment would extend furthermore with African Americans, as civil rights were one of the political goals of this movement, and this would actually be one of the greatest successes of this time. As you would have expected, the older, more traditional generation was not so happy about this movement. Barry Goldwater, candidate against LBJ, would be one of the representatives of the conservatives against this movement, a Republican who criticized the civil rights laws and Johnson's Great Society. This generation would be the same people who experienced the hardships of the Great Depression and the Second World War. So it was understandable that they saw the 60s movement as unnecessary, and that these kids were just ungrateful and looking for something to be cynical about. And you know what? They're kind of right. And of course, with anything that the hippies said, there would be the conservatives who'd fight back and say, you know what? No, there should be no integration, no drugs, no sex, like premaritally, because that's sinful. The overall impact of this cultural movement was that the political goals that they fought so hard for were actually achieved by the end of the 1960s, such as civil rights, more gender and sexual equality, and the end of the Vietnam War. So a way for you to remember the awesomeness of the 1960s are 3 Ps. The first one being the population bulge of the boomers, and I did not make that up, I don't use boomers, I never did. P, protest against racism in Vietnam War, and P, permanent look of prosperity. So that is the 1960s. Hey yo, we're done. So a quick recap of this time. It was a time of much cultural change in terms of sex, drugs, civil rights, gender, all of that jazz. And there was also a fight for peace in terms of war, imperialism, poverty. It was just a whole load of awesomeness. And these so fought for liberties will actually become mainstream in society, and they won't just die away like everything else. And I am so thankful that they fought so hard, even though they kind of look dumb sometimes, they actually fought hard for what matters. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it. I hope your noggin was filled with this juicy information, and I hope I get a good grade. I'm kidding. Thank you.